They told you to find yourself, but they never told you what you'd have to lose. In a world that constantly whispers, "Be somebody," Carl Jung quietly offered the most terrifying truth, that to become who you truly are, you must first be willing to die to who you think you are. This is the beginning of individuation, not a trend, not a self-help tactic, but the oldest and most sacred journey of the soul. A descent into the forgotten corridors of your psyche, where light and darkness dance as one and where the ego is no longer king but servant. Individuation is the rebirth that follows the symbolic death. It is not taught in schools or whispered at dinner parties because it demands something society cannot promise: the courage to dismember the self in order to rebuild it, authentically, painfully, and wholly. Carl Jung called this the central process of human development. Unlike Freud, who searched the basements of the mind for pathology, Jung was looking for a blueprint, a spiritual map buried inside every human being. He believed we each possess a deep, unconscious archetypal path of transformation, and that unless we walk it, we live a half-life, haunted by shadows, caught in roles, and ruled by masks we mistake for our faces. In the Red Book, Jung does not teach individuation abstractly. He lives it. He dives into his own madness, listens to the voices within, and confronts images so powerful they burn themselves into the foundations of analytical psychology. In it, we see him lose all attachment to the rational world, descending into visions of serpents, prophets, dead gods, and divine mothers. Not because he was unwell, but because he was becoming whole. He writes, "Individuation means becoming an individual, and, insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self." But don't be misled. Becoming yourself is not a gentle unveiling. It is a psychic crucifixion. Individuation is not about perfecting the ego. It is about transcending it. The ego is the provisional self, the actor in the play of culture, career, and compliance. Jung saw it as necessary but not sovereign. Behind the ego stands the self, the true center of the psyche, vast and unknowable, both divine and dangerous. The self is not something we create. It is something we encounter, and the moment we do, the ego must bow. This is the secret most never dare to utter. The soul doesn't care if your ego survives the process. Jung understood that individuation often begins in chaos, a midlife crisis, a breakdown, a dream that won't go away. He called it a nekia, a descent into the underworld of the unconscious. And just like the heroes of myth, we are asked to confront our fears, our repressed desires, our unlived lives, all that we push down to survive the expectations of family, culture, and religion. The shadow appears first, the parts of ourselves we deny or disown, the anger we pretend not to have, the envy we judge in others, the lust we tuck under moral platitudes. To individuate is to integrate the shadow, not to destroy it, because what you suppress does not vanish. It grows teeth in the dark. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Individuation asks you to look at the ways in which you are not free, the patterns you repeat, the people you blame, the emptiness you medicate. It demands that you own them, one by one, without excuse, because only what is owned can be transformed. This process is not linear. It is not a staircase, but a spiral. You return to old wounds with deeper understanding. You revisit the same symbols, but they speak differently now. Archetypes begin to reveal themselves. The mother, the wise old man, the trickster, not as characters from fairy tales, but as psychological energies alive within you. They are not you, but they live in you. To individuate is to dialogue with them, to hear their stories, and to understand their power. In Symbols of Transformation, Jung writes that myths are not dead stories but living maps of the psyche. The journey of the hero is not a metaphor. It is the architecture of the unconscious. Just as Osiris is dismembered and reborn, just as Christ descends into hell before rising, so too must we be broken before we can be whole. And wholeness is the goal, not perfection, not happiness. Wholeness. Individuation doesn't guarantee peace, but it gives you authenticity. It doesn't erase pain, but it gives it meaning. The world may still reject you, misunderstand you, mock you, but you will no longer be alien to yourself. This is why Jung called individuation a religious process, not in dogma or doctrine, but in the sacred reconnection to the divine center within. The self is both psychological and spiritual. It is the God image imprinted in the soul, beyond gender, beyond personality. To meet the self is to brush against the eternal. But beware, those who see God must also wrestle with the devil, because the deeper you go, the more opposites you must hold. Jung taught that true individuation integrates not just light, but also darkness, not just reason, but madness, not just order, but chaos. The way to the self is always a detour through the other. And here lies the paradox. You cannot individuate alone, yet no one can do it for you. The soul's path is carved in contradiction. You are asked to stand alone, yet surrender. You are asked to step inward, yet integrate what's outside. You are asked to let go, yet take full responsibility. This is why most resist individuation, not because they are weak, but because they were never told the truth, that growth is often indistinguishable from unraveling. To become whole is to walk through fire, and fire does not ask for your permission. Jung wrote of the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites, drawn from the alchemical texts he spent decades decoding. What medieval mystics described in strange diagrams and cryptic phrases, Jung interpreted psychologically. He saw alchemy as a symbolic language for individuation, the merging of the conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and dark, spirit and matter. In psychology and alchemy, he explains that transformation is not a ladder to heaven, but a cycle of death and rebirth. The nigredo, the blackening, marks the painful beginning, a dissolution of old identity, often mistaken for depression, but it is necessary. Without the collapse of the false self, the true self cannot emerge. Then comes the albedo, the whitening, the stage of illumination, where insight breaks through the rubble of your past. But even here, danger awaits, inflation, grandiosity, the temptation to believe you've arrived. The ego tries to steal the crown too soon, so the process descends again, deeper, sharper, through the rubedo, the reddening. Here, the opposites no longer battle. They burn together. The self is glimpsed, not as perfection, but as a living symbol of wholeness, the union of all that you are, and all that you will never fully understand. Jung believed that most people get stuck somewhere along this path. They achieve adaptation, social success, material stability, intellectual growth, but they avoid individuation. Why? Because individuation is not rewarded in the outer world. In fact, it threatens it. Society needs predictability. Institutions thrive on uniformity. A truly individuated person cannot be manipulated by fear, cannot be bribed by status, cannot be seduced by ideology. And so, they are often seen as dangerous or insane. Yet, paradoxically, they are also the healers, the artists, the prophets, those who carry back the fire from their own descent to light the way for others. Joseph Campbell called this the hero's journey, but unlike the Hollywood version, this journey is inward, solitary, and endlessly recursive. The cave you fear to enter, he wrote, holds the treasure you seek. Campbell was deeply influenced by Jung, seeing mythology not as fiction but as function, the psyche's symbolic roadmap toward individuation. James Hillman, another Jungian renegade, pushed the idea even further. He argued that the goal is not to rise above our complexes, but to enter them more imaginatively. He wrote, "We are not here to transcend the soul, but to deepen it." Hillman didn't want to fix the self. He wanted to listen to its poetry, its images, its dreams. He saw individuation not as a ladder, but a labyrinth, a place to wander, to lose, and find oneself again. This depth psychology offers no shortcuts, no final enlightenment, no cure, because individuation is not a state you reach, it is a process you serve. Jung once warned that anyone attempting to individuate would meet with resistance, not just from the world, but from within. The unconscious will fight back. The persona, your social mask, will cling to its scripts. Even the shadow, once integrated, may turn against you, for power gained without humility corrupts. And the self, that immense center of being, may feel so foreign, so vast, that the ego trembles before it. But this is necessary, because true transformation begins where certainty ends. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung reflected on the spiritual crisis of the 20th century, a crisis that has only deepened today. He wrote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. We project our unconscious material onto enemies, onto ideologies, onto gods, because we cannot face it in ourselves. We choose collective delusion over individual integration. This is why Jung insisted on the inner work, not out of narcissism, but because the soul, if neglected, becomes a danger to itself and others. To individuate is to take back your projections, to own your desires, to sit with your contradictions, to forgive your own humanity without excusing your mistakes. And yes, it is lonely, but it is also sacred. Individuation requires solitude, not isolation, but sacred aloneness. Jung himself often retreated to Bollingen Tower, a stone house he built with his own hands. There, he carved symbols, drew mandalas, and wrote in silence. He said he needed to live as if I were on some distant planet, not to escape life, but to return to it more fully, unclouded, undivided, undeceived. He discovered that the soul does not speak in concepts, it speaks in symbols, images, emotions, dreams. To hear it, you must descend below the noise, beyond intellect, beyond language, into the silent pulse of your own being. This descent is not easy, but it is real, it is yours, and it cannot be replaced. As Mircea Eliade once wrote, the great discoveries always take place in the depths of the soul. Individuation is that discovery, the painful, beautiful, lifelong revelation that you were never just a fragment, but a living whole, waiting to be remembered. Individuation, in its deepest essence, is not about healing your wounds. It is about discovering who is wounded, not fixing the personality, but dissolving the illusion that the personality is all you are. This is why Carl Jung placed so much emphasis on the archetypes. Archetypes, to Jung, were not inherited ideas, but primordial patterns of experience, deep structures of the unconscious that shape how we perceive, feel, and act. They are autonomous, psychic nuclei that exist beyond our will, and they are not merely symbols, they are living energies. We do not choose our archetypes, they choose us, the mother, the father, the child, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow, the trickster, the anima, the animus. These are not characters in myths, they are dimensions of the psyche, and when we repress one, it does not disappear. It returns in distorted form, in projections, in obsessions, in fate. Jung's genius was to show that individuation requires a relationship to these archetypes, not identification with them. When a man over-identifies with the hero, he may sacrifice his soul to achieve conquest. When a woman identifies too strongly with the mother, she may smother herself in caretaking, neglecting her own needs. But when we relate to the archetypes, when we see them as psychic forces rather than identities, we can begin to integrate their power without becoming possessed by them. This distinction is subtle but vital, because the true enemy of individuation is psychic inflation, when the ego believes it is the self. In Jung's writings, particularly in Ion and Symbols of Transformation, he warns of the danger of mistaking archetypal experiences for personal enlightenment. A dream of a great king does not mean you are the king. A vision of divine union does not mean you are divine. The self reveals itself through symbolic language, and symbols must be interpreted, not worshipped. This is why dreams are so central to individuation. To Jung, dreams are not just nightly noise, but messages from the unconscious, a theater where the soul stages its conflicts and desires. He advised patients not to analyze dreams mechanically, but to let the image speak. Approach the dream as you would a poem, he said. Listen with your heart, not just your head. Because the unconscious does not speak in facts, it speaks in riddles, and riddles cannot be solved, they must be lived. This is the art of individuation, the ability to hold tension between opposites without fleeing to one side, to live the paradox, to bear the uncertainty, to become the crucible in which light and shadow, reason and madness, God and animal, can burn into something whole. That's why individuation often begins with a breakdown. Jung never glamorized awakening. He knew it often arrives in the form of neurosis, anxiety, or existential despair. Not because something is wrong, but because something false is collapsing. He called this the symbolic death, a necessary dismantling of the persona, the false self we construct to fit in, to be liked, to survive. The persona is not evil, it is functional, but it must not be mistaken for the truth. As long as we believe we are our role, our image, our reputation, we remain trapped in spiritual adolescence. Individuation requires that we let that mask fall, and beneath it, we find not clarity but chaos. This chaos is the raw material of the soul, the prima materia of alchemy, the undifferentiated darkness from which something new can emerge. To navigate this, Jung proposed active imagination, a technique he developed during his own descent. Unlike passive daydreaming, active imagination is a dialogue with the unconscious, a ritualized inner vision in which one lets images arise, interacts with them, and allows them to transform naturally. It was through active imagination that Jung encountered the figures in his Red Book, Alaya, Salome, Philemon, and Abraxas, archetypal energies that emerged from within him but spoke with their own voice. He did not consider them fantasies, he treated them with respect, he asked them questions, he listened, and slowly they changed him. This is the humility individuation demands, to acknowledge that your inner world is not under your control, to treat it with reverence, to let the soul speak even when it says things you do not want to hear, because the soul's goal is not to comfort you, it is to make you whole, and wholeness is often terrifying. It includes the criminal and the saint, the murderer and the healer, the victim and the aggressor. Individuation is not about being good, it is about being real. And this, perhaps, is the greatest challenge of all. Modern psychology, the kind built on diagnosis and medication, often avoids this truth. It seeks adaptation, not transformation. It aims to relieve suffering, not understand its meaning. But Jung knew that symptoms are symbols, that the wound contains the key, that neurosis is not a disease to eradicate, but a message to decode. This is why he saw therapy not as treatment, but as initiation, a journey into the mythic, the irrational, the sacred, a space where the soul can unfold in its own time, in its own way, where the patient is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be honored. Individuation, in this light, is not a cure, it is a calling, a lifelong, soul-guided path to remembering who and what you truly are, and no one else can walk it for you. No one else can walk it for you. And yet, it is not a solitary path. Though the process of individuation is deeply personal, often isolating, often misunderstood, it is not about severing yourself from others. It's about relating to others more truthfully, without the masks, without the projections, without the unconscious agreements to stay asleep. Jung warned of the danger of collective identity, of merging into the group mind. The more people you are connected with, he said, the less individual you become. Not because relationships are wrong, but because most relationships are built upon the persona. We show others what we think they want to see. We hide our shadows. We flatter, avoid, and self-censor. And in doing so, we lose the thread of our own soul. Individuation reverses this, not by rejecting others, but by becoming inwardly free, by becoming an individual in the true sense, not a rebel, not a narcissist, but a soul who has become real, a person whose presence is not a performance, but a reflection of the inner truth. And this brings us to one of Jung's most radical insights. The self is not the ego. The self is the totality, conscious and unconscious, light and dark, personal and archetypal. When people speak of finding themselves, they often mean stabilizing the ego, gaining confidence, knowing their likes and dislikes, being consistent. But individuation leads somewhere far deeper. It reveals that the ego is only a small island in the vast ocean of the psyche. And to truly grow, we must leave the island. We must risk disorientation. We must let go of who we think we are and allow the self to speak through us. This is not a comfortable process. In fact, Jung described it as a wounding of the ego, a humbling, a sacrifice. The ego must relinquish control and enter into relationship with something greater, not God necessarily, but the symbolic center of the soul, what the ancients might have called the demon, the inner spirit, or guiding genius. And here, Jung draws deeply from alchemy. In the alchemical tradition, transformation is depicted in stages: nigredo, the blackening, dissolution, chaos; albedo, the whitening, purification, illumination; citrinitas, the yellowing, integration of opposites; rubedo, the reddening, final synthesis, the birth of the philosopher's stone. These stages are not literal, they are psychological, and they perfectly mirror the process of individuation. Nigredo is the dark night, the depression, the collapse of meaning. Albedo is the insight, the dream, the emergence of symbolic understanding. Citrinitas is the confrontation of paradox, learning to live with duality. Rubedo is the full integration, the marriage of the opposites, the realization of wholeness. Jung saw alchemy as a symbolic map of the soul's journey. The alchemists projected their inner transformations onto matter, mixing chemicals, distilling essences, transmuting base metals. But their true work, the magnum opus, was the transformation of the self. And so it is with us. We project our inner lives onto relationships, careers, ideologies. We try to control the outer world. But individuation demands we turn inward, that we reclaim the projections, that we see the enemy as our shadow, the beloved as our anima, the guru as our own inner self. This is not metaphysical speculation, it's practical liberation. Because every time we reclaim a projection, we become more whole. Every time we withdraw an inflated fantasy or a demonized judgment, we return energy to the soul. Every time we hold the tension of opposites without fleeing, we become more real. And this reality is not fixed. As Jung said, individuation is not a goal to be reached, but a way of life. It is not something you finish. It is a spiral that deepens. You circle back to your wounds, but with new eyes. You meet your demons again, but with more love. You face the unknown again and again, but with growing trust, because trust is what replaces certainty. The ego wants control, plans, guarantees. The soul wants mystery, openness, surrender. This is why individuation often involves a spiritual awakening, though Jung was careful not to equate individuation with religion. In fact, he believed that most religious systems have lost their soul. They have become dogmatic, externalized, disconnected from the inner symbolic life. For Jung, a true spiritual life begins when you take your dreams seriously, when you listen to your inner figures, when you stop looking outward for salvation and begin to treat your own psyche as sacred territory. He once wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." And this awakening, this individuation, is never a straight line. It is not linear self-improvement. It is not a ladder of success. It is a labyrinth, a twisting path through your own contradictions, a descent into the underworld where your golden shadow waits, a return to the world, not as the person you were, but as the self you have become. To walk the path of individuation is to commit to truth, not the truth of ideologies or beliefs, but the deeper, symbolic truth that reveals itself in images, dreams, and synchronicities. Carl Jung did not believe in truth as something fixed or possessed, but as something lived, something emergent, something born from the psyche itself. He once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But choosing to become something real requires the courage to encounter everything unreal inside us first. This is why so few take the path all the way. They touch the edges, they taste the truth. But when the illusions begin to dissolve, when the masks melt, when the false self disintegrates, panic sets in. This is the crisis of identity, because individuation does not tell you who you are. It strips away who you are not. It leaves you naked. It leaves you in the in-between, the liminal space. Jung called this period the enantiodromia, the turning into the opposite. It is the moment when your old structures collapse, but the new self has not yet taken form. It is chaos, but not senseless chaos. Rather, it is symbolic deconstruction, and it often coincides with external upheaval. Relationships change, careers end, beliefs dissolve. You become a stranger to yourself. But something deeper is forming. Here is where figures like Joseph Campbell expand on Jung's foundation. Campbell's monomyth, the hero's journey, is a cultural echo of individuation. The call to adventure, the descent into the underworld, the trials, the helpers, the death and rebirth. These are not just mythic stories. They are blueprints of the human soul's unfolding. Individuation is the hero's journey lived in psychological terms, but Jung would say that the hero must eventually die. Even the inner hero must be sacrificed, for the sake of wholeness, because individuation is not about becoming ideal. It's about becoming whole. Whole includes the fool, the betrayer, the coward, the tyrant. The parts of us we would rather exile must be brought back in, not acted upon, but owned. Here, the work of James Hillman, Jung's successor in archetypal psychology, adds a critical depth. Hillman emphasized that the soul does not want to be cured. It wants to be seen. It wants to be dignified in its complexity, not simplified into wellness or success. In Hillman's words, psychology must be a language of soul, not a manual for adjustment. So, the process of individuation is not therapy in the modern sense. It is not about fixing you. It's about listening to the figures that live within you, giving voice to the silence, giving image to the invisible. That's why dreams are central. Jung considered dreams to be the royal road to the unconscious, not mere random firings of the brain, but symbolic messages from the self to the ego. He taught that dreams contain compensatory wisdom. If the ego is too proud, the dream humbles. If the ego is too small, the dream expands. If the ego is lost, the dream points the way. But few people truly listen. Most dismiss their dreams, or they interpret them literally. Or worse, they only look for positive meaning. But dreams often bring darkness, shadows, dead animals, floods, fires, deformed children. These images are not signs of illness, they are invitations. They are the unconscious demanding to be heard. And so, Jung said, the dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. To walk the path of individuation is to open that door, again and again, and what you find behind it will not be tame. You will meet gods and monsters. You will meet your father's voice, your mother's pain. You will meet your abandoned child waiting in the ruins of your memory. You will meet the person you might have been, the unlived life. And this is one of Jung's most haunting insights. The unlived life does not disappear. It lives in the unconscious. It festers. It emerges as symptoms, resentment, neuroses, projections. It haunts the next generation. This is why individuation is not selfish. It is sacred responsibility. What you do not face will be passed on. What you do not integrate will become someone else's burden. The individuation of one soul echoes outward, into family, into culture, into history. It is not loud. It does not require fame. It happens in silence, in rooms where no one sees, in the dreams you dare to remember, in the truths you dare to speak to yourself, and perhaps most painfully, in the love you dare to offer your own shadow. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the final turn of the spiral. You do not transcend the ego. You do not conquer the shadow. You become a vessel, large enough to hold both. By the time Jung reached the later stages of his life, the idea of individuation had deepened into something close to spiritual. Not religious, not doctrinal, but mystical. He called it the symbolic life. It meant living not merely in facts or data, but in meaning, to see the world and your life not as a machine, but as myth. Individuation is not complete when the shadow is integrated, or when the persona is seen through, or even when the self has been touched. It is complete when the ego learns to live in relation to the self, like the moon reflects the sun. This is what Jung meant by psychic wholeness, not perfection, but relationship, dialogue, sacred tension between the opposites, and yet few people arrive here. Because even after the great descent into shadow, the journey does not end. After the darkness, you face emptiness. After the storm, silence. After death, rebirth, but a rebirth with no name, no path, no guarantees. You don't come back as the same person because the person you were never truly existed. Jung said, "What is it then that binds man to the world? His wholeness, not his perfection. Wholeness is not some golden, unshakable state. It's a continual process of becoming. It's being shattered and reformed again and again, each time more authentic, each time more real." And this is perhaps where Jung broke away most radically from mainstream psychology. Because in a world obsessed with optimization, Jung dared to ask a more ancient question. What is the soul asking of you? Not, what's your job? Not, what are your goals? But, what symbolic burden were you meant to carry? This is where individuation becomes deeply existential. It is not about achievement. It is about alignment. Alignment with something transpersonal, a center that exists beyond the ego's understanding. And this center has always been symbolized by the self, the divine image within. The self is not you. It is not the best version of you. It is the God image, the pattern of wholeness, the archetype that contains all opposites. To move closer to it is to experience synchronicity, dream visitations, overwhelming emotion, spiritual awakening, and sometimes madness. Because approaching the self is like approaching the sun. You must come close enough to receive its warmth, but not so close that you are destroyed by its fire. This is why humility is essential on the path. You are not the master of your psyche. You are a guest. You are a witness. You are a vessel for something infinitely older than you. Other thinkers grasped this too, in their own ways. Mircea Eliade spoke of initiation, the ancient death-rebirth rituals that paralleled individuation. Robert Bly warned of the sibling society, a culture with no elders, no inner authority, no spiritual maturity. Marion Woodman brought individuation into the body, into the feminine, the mythic, the cellular memory of the soul. But all return to the same root. To be human is to carry the weight of becoming whole. You do not finish individuation in this lifetime. It is a spiral, a rhythm, a breath. You descend, you integrate, you return. And in the return, you serve. This is the most sacred element of individuation. Not what you gain, but what you give. Not what you discover, but what you embody. Because after the fire, after the visions, after the darkness and the healing, you must return to the world and bring soul with you. This is the final teaching of individuation, that the self does not belong to you. You belong to it. And your task, your holy burden, is to live a symbolic life in a world that has forgotten what symbols are. So when you feel lost, when you dream of strange places, when your life collapses or your meaning dissolves, when you are called into the silence, know that it is not the end. It is the beginning of the inward path, the death and rebirth of the self, not to become someone else, but to finally become what you truly are. And what you are, in your deepest center, is not a role or identity, but a living mystery. That is the secret Jung left behind. Not to follow him, but to follow the unknown within you.